Hi, I'm Stephen Robbins, and I'm here today with Anne Latham and the Power of Clarity. Welcome, Anne.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm looking forward to our conversation.
So, one of the things I found interesting about the title of the book, which you just addressed right off the top, is I saw the power of clarity, and I thought that sounds really cool, except for the fact that I don't actually know when pressed what clarity even means, because to me, certainly everything I say and do always seems clear to me. So te- tell us, what is the book about? What is clarity? Why is it a problem or a benefit? Like orient us.
The word clarity itself is incredibly unclear, which is really sad. We have more commonly shared, understood vocabulary to talk about the temperature of soup than we do to talk about levels of clarity. We know that soup can be scalding or hot or lukewarm or cool or cold. But with clarity, we just say, well, it's a little confusing, a little unclear, not quite clear enough. And we don't even know which one of those is the worst or which one of those is the best. So we don't really have a sense of what clarity is. It's like this spot around in the ether, and we're just a little bit off. And furthermore, we generally think we're pretty clear, and our coworkers are not as clear. So let me just give you my sense of what clarity is. So to me, clarity is knowing exactly what you're trying to accomplish, how you're going to get there, with whom you're going to go work to get there, who you're going to have to work with, and then what you've removed all the distractions and you've got what you need, the resources, so that you can truly focus and drive through to accomplish whatever you're talking about. So clarity can be at, the gross level for the whole corporation, knowing what they're trying to do and not having too much on their plate and being able to focus resources and get there. But it can also be the next 10 minutes. What are you going to do in the next 15 minutes? What's going to be different before the end of this meeting? What's going to be different before lunch? And that's clarity and the ability to really be specific and focused.
So it sounds like, if I can take that one step slightly further, it sounds like you are specifically defining clarity with respect to our ability to achieve things in the world. Because everything you just said was about knowing what you're doing, where you're going, how you're getting there, etc. Is clarity and achievement, are those tightly coupled concepts?
Well, to me, I'm operating in the world of businesses where people are trying to get things done. So that's the way I'm going to talk about it. So it's being really clear about what you're trying to do. And my book's loaded with tips about how you can be clear and also how unclear you are, so that you understand what problem it is we need to solve here. The first chapter is called "We're Not as Clear as We Think We Are," and it's costly. And one of our problems right now is that we are what I call clarity blind. We don't realize how unclear we are, and we don't see how much waste is coming out of that. And people who read chapter 1 are usually going, oh my God, she's right. We really do these things, and it really is wasteful. But if we can be more specific about what we're trying to accomplish and more focused, and we know how we're going to get there, we'll get more done.
So, one of the things that you talk about, and I loved this idea because at least for me, this was one of those aha moments. You define something called a treadmill verb, and
Yes.
I was reading that section of the book, and I thought, wow, well, these are things I do all the time. Like, of course, I do X and Y and Z, and you're calling them treadmill verbs. Could you enlighten us and please spare our egos, because I suspect that probably at least one other person who's watching has maybe used these verbs before. But what is a treadmill verb? What are some examples, and why should we love them or not?
Well, the treadmill verbs is probably my most famous creation, but treadmill verbs are words like report, review, communicate, share, update, inform. These are words we use all the time. And furthermore, they fill our agendas for our meetings. There are project reviews, and there are updates, and they're sharing. But what I call them treadmill verbs, because there's no way to know when you're done. It's like being on a treadmill where you can always go another mile, or you can always go another 10 minutes. Well, with treadmill verbs, you can always report for another 10 minutes. There's no way to know when you're done. So we spend so much time, directing people and putting on our agendas treadmill verbs that those are open invitations to talk without a distinct outcome in mind. And it's a waste of time. It generates all this waste.
So what would you recommend? Presumably there are verbs that we could use that are more specific, or maybe a framing around it. But let's say, okay, let's say you're talking to me. I'm a manager, and I say, Anne, I want you to know that I am being very clear with all of my employees. Every Monday we have a meeting where everyone gets updated on the status. And
Yeah.
you're sitting here thinking, oh my God, that meeting probably runs for 9 hours and accomplishes nothing. What would you tell me to put on the agenda instead of status update?
Okay. Well, the good news is while there are tons of treadmill verbs, there are only a few destination verbs that really matter. And there's about 6, really. And so the what I call them cognitive objects. I call these my cognitive 6. When you're in a meeting, what you're really trying to accomplish are only a couple things. One's a decision. A decision is a fork in the road. And once you've made that decision, you know you are done and you've unleashed the next steps. So decide is a destination verb, and you should only be driving towards decisions. Plus the other 5. Okay, so the second one is plans. When you make a plan, you know you are done because you've got a plan. You've got something concrete that unleashes next steps. The third one is the problem resolution. Same idea. You know you're done when you have a solution to the problem and it unleashes next steps. The fourth one is a list. And that might sound interesting. When you make a list, and if you're clear about what you're putting on your list, you know when you're done because you've run out of things to add to your list. But a list is important because it's an input to your decisions, your plans, and your problem resolutions. For instance, with a plan, you need things like lists of action items and lists of resources and lists of risks and lists of constraints, lists of priorities. So these are concrete, tangible things that you can pursue that unleash the next step, which is probably completing your plan. The fifth one is confirm, is the destination verb, but confirmation is the cognitive object you're looking for. Typically, confirmation comes in when you go into a meeting and you say, look, I've done this and I'm planning to do this next. Am I on the right track? And what you're looking for is a yes or a no answer. It's very simple. You're on the right track. Good. You're good to go. It unleashes the next step. Unfortunately, what happens when someone typically comes into a meeting and said, well, I've done this and I'm thinking of doing this next, is that everyone starts flooding them with advice. And sometimes that advice is on step 10 when this person is really on step 3 of something. They're not even thinking about that. It's way too far out, but everyone is so helpful. They just give so much advice. Number 6 is the verb is approve or authorize. And what you're looking for is authorization. Again, if you get approval, you know it. You're done. Someone has said, yes, this is good. We agree. And it unleashes the next steps. So at any meeting, you should be trying to concentrate exclusively on deciding, planning, resolving problems, listing necessary inputs to those first 3, confirming things, and authorizing things. Now, I do have one caveat. I know a lot of people who turn planning into treadmill verb. So you got to be a little careful there because some people can plan forever.
Well, I'm looking at this going, it's too bad I don't have my Get It Done Guy podcast anymore, because one of the very first episodes that I ever did was on types of meetings. And I said there were 3 types of meetings. One are meetings to exchange information, and you should find out if there's some other way other than having a meeting to exchange information. I said there are meetings to make decisions, and I forgot what the third kind was. Information, decisions, something else. That doesn't matter, however, because I would want to substitute that episode with what you just said. You've made a few more distinctions than I ever made, and these are all. I mean, I love the fact that every description you just gave, you ended that section with, and then the next step, what it is. So,
yes.
So this makes a meeting agenda item clear by actually giving us something to do that's going to result in forward movement. I'm also
Absolutely.
looking at this going, this is not unique to companies. I have I have hired consultants, for example, to help me with things, and I've said, "Oh, tell me how to do the thing," and what they do is they go on forever and ever and ever. And there are times when I have asked them for confirmation. Like literally, all I want to know is, I am about to send out this email. Is this the email? Is what I'm sending out the email that you told me I should send out? Like when you read this, is this actually communicating to people the information that you told me that I should communicate? All I want is a yes or no. I don't want a
Yep.
20-minute brainstorming session. I don't want a lecture on the history of email writing and why it's a, just like,
Yeah.
just tell me, is this the right thing or not? So I'm kind of looking at this
Yeah.
going, I'm going to take this list, I'm going to tattoo it on the inside of my eyelids. And then I'm going to start walking into meetings, reframing all the agenda items, and people are going to think I'm brilliant. And they're going to say, how are you able to do this? And I'm going to say, I don't know, because it's on the inside of my eyelids. So I'm not going to know that. But I am going to just buy them a copy of your book and kind of nudge it across the table after
Yeah.
them and say,
Well, that's a good
and
idea.
they have the answer.
And the good news is that
Um,
there's really only those 6 things. So it's really not that hard to figure out, what decision do we need? What plan do we need? What problem resolution do we need? Pretty
yeah,
simple.
that's nice. So we have a meeting, we have next steps, and then we as individuals go back to our desks and we start to carry out those next steps. And you have a phrase that I really liked. Now I was thinking, kind of like Happy Days when I read this, and like driving my car around the beach. But you call it cruising with confidence. And I didn't grow up in the 1950s, and I didn't have a car, and I didn't go cruising around the beach. So I'm fairly sure that that's not what you mean by this. Tell us about cruising with confidence. What is it? How do I know I'm doing it? Do I want to? Is it
Yeah,
legal?
cruising with confidence is about the way you are when you are in the zone and you're ultra productive and you know exactly what you're trying to do and you know how you're there, and you just get in the zone and you bang things out and you get it done, and you're totally confident because you do have that clarity. And remember, clarity is knowing exactly what you're trying to accomplish, knowing how you're going to get there, having that sense of process, knowing whom you need to work with, and having things cleared out of your way so that you can be in the zone and not be distracted or disrupted or run up with obstacles that you didn't foresee.
That sounds a lot like flow, um,
Yep.
or the concept of flow. So this, in fact, this is a, you actually just hit a framework in there, and I'm going to call you out on that. Um,
Okay.
you're in essence, you've given a list of things that are preconditions to flow. That if I want to get in a state of flow, you said I should have a specific outcome in mind. You mentioned something about process clarity or about knowing steps,
Yeah.
and then about getting other stuff out of your way. Tell me about those. How do I do
Right.
that?
Okay.
What exactly do
So
those all mean?
there are really 3 pillars of clarity, and one is that you need to know exactly what you're trying to accomplish, and that is the thing we're missing most often is specificity. Are we really specific about what we're trying to accomplish? And like, I can give you great examples. I was in an executive team meeting where there were these really smart, dedicated, hardworking professionals who they wanted to talk to me about a project, but they had this urgent issue come up first. So they were going to talk about that. And they started diving in and doing what everyone does in meetings, and went around and around. And after just a few minutes, I interrupted them. And I said, wait a minute, did you realize you are talking about 5 different decisions and 2 different plans all at the same time? And of course, their immediate reaction was to be really irritated with me for interrupting them. But then I listed the 5 decisions and the 2 plans, and all of a sudden they knew I was right. They knew exactly what order they needed to make those decisions in, and they knew exactly what those plans needed to look like to start with. And within 15 minutes, they'd made all those decisions and laid the first steps of the plan. And I swear, and interrupted, they would have talked for an hour and then had to schedule another meeting. So what I brought to that is that specificity. These are those 5 cognitive objects, those 5 very specific decisions you need to make. And I broke it down. And by being that specific, they got it and they were released to move forward. Now, the second part after specificity comes process clarity. And when you think of it, processes, first of all, processes are often defined as a series of activities. And that's like, no, 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 no. It's got to be a series of outcomes. Little outcomes add up to big outcomes. Intermediate outcomes have to be the result of each step in your process. And you need to be just as specific as creating your decision about what you're trying to accomplish. So a process is just specificity over time. So you have paying more attention to process. Okay, what's the next outcome? What's the one after that? And you sometimes you have a standard process, but other times you got to make it up. But you have to stop and pay attention, because anytime you don't have a process, you're wandering. You're not going to get in that zone. You're not going to cruise with confidence because you're fishing. You're wandering around. So in addition to specificity and process clarity, the third key component here is focus. You need to be able to focus. And that means you need to be able to turn off disruptions and prevent the interruptions and prevent all the distractions. A lot of times we are the key culprits in interrupting and distracting ourselves. You have to turn those off. But another piece of focus is being sure you don't have too much to focus on. You don't have too many priorities so that you're constantly distracted in your brain, and that you don't encounter obstacles. You have the resource lined up that you need so that you can stay on track. And the whole outcome here is with the specificity and a sense of the process and focus, then you get in that zone, you have that flow, you can cruise with confidence, and you will be ultra productive. And I'd say the reason I call it cruising with confidence is because I wanted to get the word confidence in there, because that is when we're clear, when we really know what we're trying to do, we are so confident. We're able to stand up and speak up and plow through obstacles. And that sense of confidence is a huge part of that flow.
Okay, so first of all, right, the problem with doing a live stream is that when you say something that really gets me thinking, right, I can't go off and think about that on my own for a few minutes. I have to come right back and continue the conversation. But okay, I've considered myself a process thinker, like basically my entire career, and I've said what I do is process. I understand how things work, how they happen, and I help people redesign processes, right? I started my career as an engineer. I basically am an engineer. I just also now do engineering with people systems and with companies and with individuals, no longer with computers and with machines. However, in all of those years, and since I'm 29, we're talking at least 7 or 8 years here. In all of those years, I've always thought of process as a series of verbs. And you just said a process is a series of outcomes. And I'm kind of running that in my mind going, I think this is one of the most profound statements I've ever had someone say to me. Could you please say more about that? Yeah, just say more about that, because
Yeah.
I'm sitting here just going like, whoa.
When you say a process is a series of verbs, then you're talking about activity. You can verbs like discuss and report and review, those are just activities that don't necessarily lead to any outcome. So you think in terms of a process, and I should step back, because a process can be a huge, big organizational process, like how you develop organizational strategy. A process can be a building block process, like how you make decisions, a four-step process that you always use, which, by the way, no one ever uses. Or a process
Right.
can be a standard process, like how engineers go through a process to test software. But you also have a process. Let's put it this way: you're always using a process. It just might be a really bad, not thought out, well-defined process, because a process is the series that you go through. So just as a meeting should always be focused on driving to those cognitive objects that make a difference, the decisions, the plans, the problem resolutions, the list, the confirmations, and the authorizations that will actually constitute progress, you need to think in terms of those kinds of concrete destinations at all times. What's the next one I'm going to achieve, and what's the one after that? So even if you're sitting down at your desk all by yourself and you're about to dive into a project, maybe you're going to write an article, you can just start writing, or you can stop and say, okay, what's the general topic? how do I want my audience to react after they're reading this? What needs to be different when they're finished reading this article? What kind of reaction do I want? And then that's kind of the bigger picture, but then you break it down. So what's the first paragraph have to do? What's the second paragraph have to do? And it makes it sound like it's too detailed and too rigorous, but it's just thinking through what are those intermediate outcomes that are going to get you to the bigger outcome that helps you achieve what you're trying to achieve.
In keeping with the thinking that this is actually an extremely profound distinction that you've made, because it's not one that I've ever heard before. I've heard that you should think of processes as steps, but by thinking of it in terms of outcomes and then linking that to this idea of the, I forgot what you call them, the ones that aren't the treadmill verbs, the ones that are the specific cognitive deliverables. So which one?
Destination verbs and the cognitive objects. My 6 cognitive objects are those outcomes.
Got it. Okay. So by thinking in those terms, one of the things that I was taught when I first learned how to do project management back in ancient prehistory was that every step of a project should be an active verb, and it should be like a subject object verb, right? And that itself was revolutionary for a lot of people that I was learning with, because they were like, oh, the project step that I had listed was status report. And now I have to make it a verb. Is that write the status report, or is that review the status report? Now you're coming along and you're saying, wait a minute, it's not just any old verb. It's not that your project plan is just made up of words like review and update. You're saying there are 7 specific verbs, and if you use those as a guide for how to break your project down, you're going to have clarity the whole way through, and thus action the whole way through.
Right. Exactly.
Okay.
So if you think in terms of managing a project, and you think project update is a really common agenda item, and I sometimes do exercises with these groups of people when I'm speaking to them, and I'll have them break up in pairs and brainstorm for just 2 minutes how many different topics might come up in the course of a project review. And in just 2 minutes, like one not very large group came up with 67 different directions that project review could go, because there are so many things you could talk about, from anything to do with, what the customer wants, the status of the work going on, risk, schedule, budget. Depends, I'm sure you can dream up a ton of possibilities. But we sit down and we have a project review, and it runs all over the place. So you need to say, okay, what decisions need to be made? Make a list of risks. What risks do we need to deal with? And then with each risk, which ones can we mitigate? Which ones can we live with? What do we need to do about each risk? So you're making decisions about the items on your list of risks, and you're making decisions about how to handle customer concerns or customer complaints. You're making decisions about how to handle budget overruns. And instead of just informing in a real loose, sort of talky way, and what happens, of course, is when people report or inform, is they try to figure out how to sound intelligent and use up their 5 minutes of allotted time in the meeting. And they don't get to, wait a minute, what have we learned this week that we didn't know last week? That's a list, What's going to bite us that we are taking for granted? That's another list. And then you can deal with these things. And it's not just being, touchy-feely and random about what you're talking about.
So I'm sitting here. I'm sitting here thinking, why did I not discover you 8 years ago when I was 21? So I actually made this big long outline of things I wanted to talk about, and in our little pre-green room meeting, I said it's going to be a minor miracle if we get to all of them. And sure enough, I'm looking at the time, and it's got to be a minor miracle. So I have to make a decision, and the decision is: do I ask you to talk about cognitive traps or clarity in the moment? And the thing that was interesting that you have this list of things called cognitive traps. And I think that's where I'm going to go, because I want our listeners to understand how badly they need your book, The Power of Clarity. The cognitive traps that you listed, I'd like you to talk a little bit about those. And what I found so fascinating about this list is, had you asked me and not called them cognitive traps, had you called them best practices, I would have read the book and gone, oh yes, I do all of these things. But that's not what you called them. You called them traps, and you made a very compelling case for why they're traps. And I looked at this and said, oh my golly, all of my best practices are kind of worst practices from the perspective of clarity. Can you just tell us a couple of those and why it is that they actually aren't best practices and are cognitive traps?
Okay, so I wanted to ask you which ones are your favorites, but let me just say that one of the main ones is
SWOT
that we start with
analysis.
SWOT. Okay, good. That's where I was going. Okay, we start with how, and that's a general trap. But let me use what you just mentioned. Okay, SWOT analysis: strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, threats. This is a common little tool people use. They make a little grid and they put the strengths and the weaknesses, opportunity, threats in each quadrant, and they brainstorm a whole bunch of stuff to throw in this quadrant, and then they supposedly can take something away from that. Now, the biggest problem with SWOT is that there's no C in SWOT, which C stands for customer. It's like the C is sort of embedded in the opportunities, maybe, but we're not paying enough attention to customer when we use SWOT. We're not starting with the real world and figuring out what the market needs. So I think the only reason SWOT is popular is because it's easy to remember. It's easy to draw your grid, and it's easy to brainstorm what goes in each of the little boxes. But it's what's rarely an appropriate tool for developing strategy or solving any other kind of problem, as far as I can tell. It's too internally focused, and I could go on and on what's wrong with it. But what happens is that we glom on to tools like that, and we think, well, this is the how we should use. This is the approach we should use, and we don't start at the top and figure out what needs to be different when we're done. What are we really trying to accomplish here, and break it down into a better process that makes more sense. So that's an example of the getting caught up in the how and not thinking through. And there's several other examples in the book of this where you get pulled down the stream with the wrong stream.
So
So
I want
the
to do one
second
more real
category,
quick. Oh, go ahead.
yeah, go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say, because one of the things you talk about is should. One of the cognitive traps is should. And when I think about should, what I think is best practices, right? If the best practice is to send out a customer survey to find out what customers want, and by the way, that's not a best practice, but if that were a best practice, then we should do that. So I have thought a lot about, oh, shoulds are a big thing because shoulds are how we adopt best practices. That clearly is not your perspective.
No, you getting caught up in shoulds is just as bad as getting caught up in hows. You said that customer surveys is not a best practice anymore. It's like, I wish you'd tell all those people who keep sending me surveys that, because I get inundated with those in my email all the time. But the problem with those is they rarely ask specific enough questions that end up with actionable advice. It's like, what are you willing to change? What do you really want to know? And again, I've got several examples in my book, but I was one time went to the a consultants group. I went to their annual meeting, and I got there early, and the board of the directors of the group were sitting around designing a survey for all their members. And I was listening to them, and I stopped. I interrupted again. I'm really good at interrupting people and saying, what are you trying to do? What do you hope to get out of this survey? What are you willing to change? What do you want to act on, or what don't you? But they looked at me like I was nuts, and then they just went back and ignored me, and dreaming up questions. Oh, we could ask them this. Oh, we could ask them that. But nothing was going to come back that was actionable, that would allow them to make a decision.
Well, or resolve a problem, or make a plan, or make a list, or confirm something. Wow, there's my alarm, which I forgot to turn off. Wow. Okay. So I hope that our listeners and watchers have had the same reaction I have, which is I'm sitting here going, I am going to write down things like destination verbs, and I'm going to commit them to memory, and I'm going to start filtering my agenda items through this. And I am going to start paying attention to the things that you list as the cognitive traps and notice when I'm using them. And probably if I walk away with any one thing that you I think you said it explicitly once, but you've certainly implied it in the way you've talked about everything, is that pretty much everything here is outcome oriented. The question you're always asking is, how do you want the world to be different after a particular step of a process? What's the outcome of that step? How do you want the world to be different, group of employees, after we have this meeting? How do you, etc. And I think that's a really powerful question to just ask everywhere. How do you want the world to be different? Even if it's something internal, like I want us to be happy. That's why we're having pizza for lunch. This is a team bonding thing. And and by the way, if it's not accomplishing the job, then I can save it on the pizza bill, and instead we can go to an escape room, or or give people the time off to go home, or whatever. So how can people find you? Where can they get your book, and like that?
Yes. So the book is called The Power of Clarity: Unleash the True Potential of Workplace Productivity, Confidence, and Empowerment. And see that's got productivity in there, and confidence, and empowerment, because this book will improve all of the above. You can find it. You should be able to find it most anywhere. It's published by Bloomsbury, so it should be on Amazon and in all the bookstores that you can find. And my website, you can go to annlatham.com, and that also has pointers to lots of additional information, and the books, my other books too. So yes, I totally think that if you take away nothing else but that question, what needs to be different when you're done, you're a huge step forward. But there's lots of other little tidbits in the book too, like there's only 5 effective ways to deal with overload, but the 6th is not choosing one of those 5. And that's called wishful thinking. And if you just chose one of the 5, you would be way, way, way ahead. And there are other little tidbits in there. There's a whole chapter on why we're not wired for clarity, because you mentioned earlier, well, don't make me feel bad, but we're not wired for clarity. We haven't been taught to see the disclarity, and we don't have the toolkit to deal with the disclarity and to create greater clarity.
Awesome.
So I wish we had twice as much time, but this is great.
Well, this is just an excuse to have you back. Thank you so much for joining us, and I hope that everyone here has had a great time. If you're watching this on LinkedIn, you can find Anne just by clicking on the event in LinkedIn. There should be a link to her profile. And thank you again, and we will have